Bargain in Death by Jack Oleg. Narrated by Chris Harvey. The silence that filled the room when Rogers had finished his narrative was not like the silence that had permeated the building earlier. It was different, even more profound, as if each of the occupants of the room were locked away in some secret world of his own. Their drinks forgotten, they sat as if mesmerized, not moving. Of them all, only the artist seemed inclined to say anything. His paint-stained fingers clasping and unclasping about his glass, he leaned toward Rogers and spoke softly. "A recurrent dream." Rogers, before he answered, downed his drink and poured himself another with hands that were suddenly trembling. "It's more than a dream, much more." For a moment he seemed reluctant to go on, but there was no derision in the eyes of the others. They too were leaning toward him, like sleepwalkers coming awake. "It's hard to explain. It seems to be with me all the time, almost as if—" "And do you have a sister?" Critchett, no longer bemused by his own thoughts, came directly to the point. "No." Rogers's reply had been just a shade too vehement, too emphatic. "Then I think I know what he means." The tall man, almost as seedy as Rogers, spoke half to himself. "Oh, really?" Critchett's voice dripped with uncalled-for sarcasm. "Do tell us." "Tell you?" The tall man's eyes narrowed, became shadowed, as if he too were remembering. "Well, why not? I have a similar vision, a similar fear. Similar, but not quite the same." "Look, it's a surefire plan, Alex." Maitland could scarcely contain himself. Everything around him, the stale odours of boarding-house cooking, the threadbare carpet, the battered typewriter sitting on a scarred table, reminded him of the failure that had dogged his footsteps all his life. But as he spoke, those things seemed to fade away, so that he could see himself in a lavish suite, surrounded by every conceivable luxury. Almost self-hypnotized, he stared at Alex out of glowing eyes. We can't miss this, can't we?" Alex did not echo his eagerness. Until this moment he had listened in silence, and he was impressed. But he had known Maitland too long and too well to rush blindly into one of Maitland's schemes. Maitland was a writer with a writer's vivid imagination, and he had shared other moments like this, other dreams of fast cars and fine clothes that had caught Maitland up in a whirl of enthusiasm and then dropped him back to earth, still a failure. "No, we can't." Maitland, his eyes no longer glowing, still spoke emphatically. Everything depended upon Alex. Everything. How ironic it would be if Alex turned him down now. Alex was a selfish, self-centered fool. But that kind of thinking would not implement the plan that he had worked on for so long and that was now so close to fruition. And the plan had to be implemented. He had had enough of cheap boarding houses that reeked of grease and that were filled with tenants with whom he shared no common ground and in whom he had no interest whatsoever. At least he and Alex shared a mutual yearning for the easy life that neither of them would ever attain by their own meagre talents. "Look, I'll go over it once more," he said, and held up the little bottle of clear liquid that he had taken from the dresser. "This will cut down my pulse and heartbeat, my entire metabolism, so that even the best doctor in the country will think that I'm dead." From the dresser he picked up another bottle, a brown one this time. "These are the heart pills that I'd be taking if I had a heart condition, so that it will look as if I'd had an attack." Alex was frowning, concentrating. The spark of cupidity that flickered in his face and that Maitland knew so well was encouraging. Alex would cooperate. He was certain of it. Well, why not? Neither of them had ever before been troubled by conscience. Your job will be to see to it that I'm buried the day after I die. There'll be enough air in the casket to last me a while. Then all you have to do is wait until night, dig me up, hide me until you collect the insurance money, and we're off and away. There, that was it. The whole beautifully simple plan. It was grisly, yes. Maitland glanced at his typewriter and shrugged mentally, but he was accustomed to dealing with the macabre. The reality could not be much worse than what he had written about so often. It would make a great story, but I'd be lucky to get £50 for it. There's no money in horror. But this way. And there's no way the insurance people can catch on? Alex's shrewd little eyes were glowing just as Maitland's had glowed, but he was still cautious. No, I've thought it all out. Nothing can possibly go wrong. Maitland set the bottles back in their places. Well? When he turned back to Alex was nodding. Yeah, all right. It sounds good. When do we do it? Tonight. Was that a sly, secretive look that had crossed Alex's face? Well, if it was, no matter. Maitland did not ponder the question. If anything, he had found the idea amusing. He had his own secrets. Agreed? Agreed. There was nothing more to be discussed. Maitland led the way to the door. Well, I'll see you soon. Alex hesitated, but only for a moment. Yeah. I'll see you soon. Not saying any more, he walked down the stairs to the street door and disappeared. He did not see the sudden smile that had appeared on Maitland's face just before he went back into his room. The smile was cold, vicious, and it remained on Maitland's face when he closed the door behind him and then crossed to the dresser and pulled open a drawer. In one corner of the drawer there was a stack of shirts, and under the shirts there was a gun. Still smiling, he checked the bullets in the gun's magazine, then stood for a long moment staring at himself in the mirror. "And after you collect the insurance, friend Alex," he said softly, "I won't need you any more." Chuckling, he pointed the gun at his reflection in the mirror and pretended to pull the trigger. Boom! Not 10 feet away on the other side of the wall on which the mirror hung, the sound of his boom was echoed by the sharp sound of a book being slammed shut. The book, a medical tome filled with anatomical drawings and photographs, was a massive one, and the sound it made was like a pistol shot, so that even the young man who had slammed it shut was startled. "Oh, sorry." Across the room from him, his roommate grinned sympathetically. They had been rooming together for 3 semesters, and the roommate, his name was Jerry, understood him perfectly. He too had been studying, and he too had reached that point which every medical student reaches at one point in time or another in the course of his education, a point at which he despairs of ever absorbing all that is required to absorb. "Trouble, Tom?" "Yeah, trouble." The young face opposite him, the tone implied that the word was the very peak of inadequacy. "Yeah, I'll never learn it. I'll never pass the anatomy course, not in a million years." Jerry's nod mirrored his complete understanding. "I know how you feel. The trouble is, we can only work in the dissection room for the short periods we're assigned to it." That they were both agreed upon. Resigned, they returned to their books, but it was only Jerry who made a real effort. In time, after he had stared for a while at the text before him without really seeing it, Tom spoke again. If only we could have a body of our own." Jerry's quizzical look caught him up short. "I mean, to work on when we want to." "Yeah, great idea." Jerry grinned at him anew. What do we do, yeah? Go out and kill somebody?" Tom was shaking his head. "No, I'm serious." "You're crazy." Shaking his head in turn, Jerry returned again to his book, but not for long. Presently his chin came up. "So, where would we put it?" Tom, concentrating, did not at first comprehend. "What? What you were just talking about? A body? Where would we put it, if we had one, that is?" Not smiling, Tom let his eyes roam about the room. Well, there! His eyes had come to rest on the wardrobe closet that contained their few articles of clothing. When he had opened the door and shoved the clothing to one side, there was a large empty space at the rear of the closet. Well, there's only one key and we have it. Oh yeah, and suppose our landlady finds it? Well, she never comes up here, does she? We clean up ourselves, no one would ever know. Somehow, unaccountably, the conversation had become deadly serious. But neither of them had become aware that they had lowered their voices, that they spoke in hushed tones, like conspirators. All right, look, so we have a place to keep a body. But where will we get a body? The question, inevitable as it was, took both of them a little by surprise, brought them back to reality. Just for a moment they had shared something new, learned something new about each other, and their newfound knowledge was oddly disquieting. But it had, too, somehow, brought them closer together. Now that, Tom said, is the problem. And he plopped himself on his bed, again the typically careless university student, so that the bed springs groaned protestingly. Maitland, in his own room, heard the groan, but only subconsciously. His mind was on other things. He was staring at the bottles on the dresser and at the hypodermic needle that lay beside them, and his face was pale. What lay ahead of him would not be pleasant. It might even be deadly. But he had long ago made up his mind to what he was about to do. Presently he took up the little bottle of clear liquid and the hypodermic and filled the hypodermic from the bottle. That done, he rolled up his shirt sleeve. The sudden, sharp, small pain when the needle entered his vein made him gasp, but his pressure on the plunger of the needle remained steady. Fascinated, he watched as the liquid in the hypodermic's plastic tube disappeared into his bloodstream. He had rehearsed the moment in his head 100 times, and what he did then he did by rote. The needle and the bottle of clear liquid were rolled up in a bit of cloth, stowed with his gun under the shirts in the drawer. Now, close the drawer. He was already beginning to see things only hazily. But there was something else to be done. His shirt sleeve, it was still rolled up. Fumbling a little, he rolled the sleeve down, buttoned it. The room was wavering, going dark. He had not thought that the injection would work so quickly. Staggering, he crossed to the bed and stretched himself up on it. A last little smile crossed his face just before the darkness took him completely. Someone, whoever first came to his door in the morning, was in for a most unpleasant shock. The someone was Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter owned the boarding house, and she was a woman of long-established habits. In the morning she rose early and prepared breakfast for her roomers as always, and, as always, was at the front door promptly at 8, just as the mail was pushed through the mail slot in the door. Sorting the mail as she went, she walked upstairs and knocked at the first door on the landing above. The door was Maitland's. "Mail, Mr. Maitland?" Maitland ordinarily was not one to miss breakfast by sleeping late, but on this occasion no sound of staring came from behind the door. "Mr. Maitland?" Curious as only boarding-house landladies can be curious, Mrs. Carter tried the knob and found the door open. It swung wide at her touch, and, she noted disapprovingly, the lights were still on in Maitland's room, even though bright sunlight streamed through the window. She would have something to say to him about that. Whatever it was that she might have said, however, was to remain unsaid. What burst from her lips was instead a shrill, frightening scream that echoed through the hall and penetrated into every room on the floor. Maitland lay fully clothed on the bed, his eyes wide and staring. But he was not lying entirely on the bed. He was on his back, arms outflung, and his head dangled limply over the edge of the bed so that she saw his slack, open mouth and his staring eyes at a crazy angle. Finding him dead would have been enough in itself to send her into hysterics. Finding him as she did made her first scream only a prelude. Shriek after shriek escaped her before she was able to control herself and to clamp her trembling lips shut. She was leaning weakly against the door jamb of Maitland's room, grey-faced and unable to speak, when Tom and Jerry burst into the hall from their own room and ran to her side. "Mrs. Carter, what is it?" For answer, Mrs. Carter's mouth opened and closed silently. She was crying with the aftermath of her first shock, and her tongue would not obey her. But there was really no need for her to speak. The slack body on the bed spoke for itself. Tom drew in his breath sharply. He and Jerry were only half-dressed. They had talked through most of the night, but the sight of Maitland was enough to drive the lingering sleepiness from their eyes and to make them look at each other significantly. Mrs. Carter would not have understood the look, even if she had seen it, and she did not see it. As she pointed, the wall telephone down the hall had begun to ring. Instinctively she moved toward it, only minimally aware that the rest of her tenants were emerging from their rooms in various stages of undress and asking excited questions. Ever the landlady, she picked the telephone receiver from its hook without really thinking about it. "Yes." The voice that answered was Alex's, but she did not know that. Her thoughts were all for Maitland. A death in a boarding house was always a bad thing. Most people disliked living in a house where a man had recently died. Preoccupied, she hardly heard Alex when he spoke. "May I speak to Mr. Maitland, please?" "Maitland?" Mrs. Carter shook herself a little, brushing away at least a few of the cobwebs that clogged her mind. A new thought had arrived to plague her. To the best of her knowledge, Maitland had no family, no one to take care of whatever had to be done. There would be arrangements to be made, bills to be paid. "Are you a friend of his?" "Yes." "A good friend?" "Yes." Mrs. Carter could breathe freely again. Perhaps, after all, Maitland's death would not be the complete disaster she had envisioned. "I think you'd better come over." At the other end of the line, Alex smiled. "Right away." He was not smiling afterward, however. Afterward, as he stood with his back to the dresser in Maitland's room and watched the doctor, his face was carefully composed to register precisely the correct degree of grief. And if there was a hint of sardonic amusement in his eyes as the doctor went about his examination, the doctor did not notice. The doctor was quite thorough. He had composed Maitland's body decently on the bed, and he was listening through a stethoscope for any lingering heartbeat. When he found none, he let the stethoscope dangle loosely from his neck and turned up Maitland's eyelids. The irises that looked unseeingly up at him were blank, lifeless. Very slowly, as the doctor bent closer to direct the beam from a tiny flashlight into those vacant eyes, Alex pulled open the dresser drawer that was just behind him. Groping, he found the rolled-up bundle that Maitland had concealed there and transferred it to the pocket of his coat. You say he had a heart condition?" The doctor had evidently concluded his examination. He had removed the stethoscope from around his neck and was returning to his medical kit. "Yes, he did." Alex's hand, still in his pocket, was sweating, but there was no hint of suspicion in the doctor's voice. He had seen nothing. Almost casually, the doctor reached out to close Maitland's eyes. Was he taking anything for it?" I think so, yeah." Careful now. It would not do to seem anxious for the doctor to find that little brown bottle. Yeah, there were pills he used to take. They must be around here somewhere." "Ah, yes, there they are." The doctor had walked toward him and was reaching behind him to take something from the top of the dresser. "Ah, yes, digioxin. I rather thought so." The bottle made a tiny clinking noise when he returned it to the dresser. "I'll make out the death certificate. When do you want to bury him?" Bury him? It had all been almost too easy. The question, so perfectly suited to Maitland's plans, made Alex stutter and stammer despite himself. "Why, He was a lonely man. He had no friends other than me. We may as well do it tomorrow, don't you think? Well, okay, good enough. The doctor, anxious to get on with his cause, was already writing, so he, like Mrs. Carter, did not see Alex's smile. Alex's momentary nervousness was gone, and he was thinking of tomorrow, of the funeral. Maitland had planned well. It was a pity, though, that Maitland would never know how well. Maitland, had he seen the smile, would have understood at once. Knowing Alex, it would have required no great effort for him to comprehend what lay behind it. But Maitland knew nothing. Maitland lay in the cheap coffin that Alex had selected a day later, and was aware neither of the cold wind that knifed between the poorly joined boards of the casket, or of the motion when the casket was lifted onto the mechanism that would lower it into the grave. It was a good day for a funeral, chilly but brightly sunlit, with just a few wisps of clouds scudding across a blue sky, and the cemetery, at such moments usually noisy with the din of weeping, was quiet. Maitland's mourners were few, just Alex, Mrs. Carter, Tom and Jerry, and none of them had reason to be overcome by grief. Only Mrs. Carter, being a female and naturally sentimental, added her voice to the vicar's as the vicar read the funeral service. Poor man! Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. The lowering mechanism creaked as the gravediggers released its cogs and wheels. There were two gravediggers, one fairly young and the other middle-aged and thick-bodied and with a perpetual simple half-smile on his face, and they were unfeelingly efficient. Mrs. Carter, overwhelmed by the solemnity of it all, again breathed, Poor man, and dabbed at her dry eyes. Alex, beside her, had difficulty in suppressing another grin, but he managed. He was even able to look properly sad as the coffin vanished into its cavity, and the others turned away to give him a last moment alone with his friend. They would have been quite startled had they looked back and heard his chuckle when he looked down into the grave before coming after them. After all, a man who has just buried a friend does not usually whisper, So long, sucker. Having said the words, however, Alex was again able to look quite sad when he continued on. Like the rest, he did not look back to where the two labourers had begun to fill the grave. And so there was something that he missed. Behind him, the thick-bodied, brutish gravedigger stopped his shovelling for a moment and was staring after the departing mourners. And as if his stare were a signal, Tom and Jerry had returned. When their eyes met, all three nodded slightly, as though confirming something of which only they were aware. Before they turned away again, the gravedigger's left eyelid dropped in a broad wink. Not even Alex was aware of the byplay. Alex, an hour later, was seated in an office, and the man opposite him was speaking in the tone that is reserved for the friends and relatives of one newly deceased. The man was an insurance inspector, and when he had finished his examination of the documents that lay before him, his voice was businesslike, but kind. Mr. Maitland's insurance policy was fully paid up. His death certificate is in order, and you're the beneficiary. I see no reason why we can't send you the proceeds of the policy within a week or so. He was unaware of Alex's relieved sigh. Oh, thanks. I wouldn't have troubled you so soon after George's death, but I have to go abroad on business. Alex's hands were sweating again. As with the doctor, it had seemed to him for just a moment that there were questions in the man's eyes. But as with the doctor, it had been only his imagination. The inspector, if anything, was quite sympathetic. I understand. I'll take care of it as quickly as I can, and may I offer my sincere regrets. Thank you. Well, you'll be hearing from us. The interview was over. Alex's chuckle this time was silent. Only when he was almost at the door did a cold chill race down his spine. The inspector's voice froze him in his tracks. By the way." "Yes?" The inspector was staring at him steadily, and panic rose in his throat, choking him. "Are you insured, sir?" The relief that flooded over him weakened his knees, but his shrug revealed nothing of the sudden turmoil inside him that had made his heart take to thudding like a trip hammer. "Oh, I'd have no one to leave it to." His legs had regained their strength. "Besides, I'm lucky. I expect to live a long, long time." The rest was said to himself, and to live well, thanks to George. He was actually almost laughing when he closed the office door behind him. Poor old George, all alone in that dismal cemetery, waiting. What a shame. Except, of course, that poor old George was not alone. Poor old George lay very still in his coffin and knew nothing of the countless corpses that kept him company on all sides, or of the cold sunlight that played across his newly dug grave and presently gave way to even colder darkness. So how could he be aware, after a time, of the two shadowy figures that entered the cemetery and stole through the gravestones towards where he lay buried? How could he know that Tom and Jerry, their young eyes tense and apprehensive, had returned? They were almost at the grave when they saw the face. It leapt up suddenly from behind a gravestone, thick-lipped and beetle-browed, and in the gloom it might have been the face of the devil himself. They were shaking with fright before they recognised it. "Oh, you!" The face came closer, resolved itself into the unlovely face and form of the gravedigger who had winked at them. He was carrying a spade and an iron crowbar. "Sorry, I gave you a fright." "Sorry? You scared us half to death. When we couldn't find you, we thought you'd backed out." "Me?" The gravedigger's grin was stupid, but tinged with eagerness. "I've been here for half an hour. Have you got the money?" "After we get the body." Tom had been the first to recover. Trembling though he was, he made his voice firm, but it required an effort. The gravedigger in the sickly moonlight was not an appealing sight. When he had considered, the man nodded. "Right." Together the three of them continued to walk toward Maitland's grave. "You two live in the same house with the deceased?" "Yes." "So?" A few more steps and they were at the pile of fresh earth that marked their destination. What do you want this body for?" Jerry, frightened but irrepressible, could not resist. "We're ghouls, yeah?" The words, if they conveyed anything to the gravedigger, did not register in his dull eyes. When he had stared at them for a few moments, he turned away and began to dig. The sound of his spade as it scraped against the stone sounded like chalk squeaking on a blackboard. Or like the squeal that Alex's bureau drawer made as he pulled it open and frowned angrily. "Damn it!" The drawer made the same nerve-rasping noise each time he opened it. He would have to buy some of that stuff that was supposed to make drawers slide easily. But he had forgotten. There was no need to ease the drawer. He would not be back. Humming, he began to take things from the drawer and to pack them into the large suitcase that lay open on his bed. By then, the gravedigger had already removed a foot-thick layer of earth from Maitland's grave. Working contentedly and seemingly unaware and unafraid of where he was and of what he was doing, he dug quickly until he was standing waist-deep in the miniature chasm that he had created. It was because of that, when he turned to throw another spadeful of earth from the grave, that he did not notice that Tom and Jerry had come closer, the better to watch him. His first intimation that they had done so came when he heard Tom's whisper gasp, "Hey!" "Huh?" Puzzled, he looked up then, and grinned vacuously. The spadeful of earth had struck Tom full in the face, and he was spluttering, choking on the black grains. "Throw it that way!" Tom's whisper this time was a hiss. A sweep of his hand indicated where the gravedigger was to toss the earth, and the hand brushed against Jerry's chest. Grimly, too nervous to be amused, Jerry stepped away so that Tom could move out of the gravedigger's range, and as he did so, a second spadeful of earth showered over Tom. "Oh, for pity's sake!" Tom was livid. He almost raised his voice, but another glance at the gravedigger dissuaded him. The gravedigger's face, when he shrugged and resumed his digging, showed no emotion, no apology, nothing. He was slow-witted, without humour or imagination, and such a man could be unpredictable, even dangerous. Shuddering a little and suddenly cold with a chill that did not come from the cold of the night air alone, Tom glanced at his watch. At least there was still plenty of time left. His watch showed a few seconds before 12. It was barely midnight. In his car, with his suitcase stowed in the seat beside him, Alex glanced at the clock on the dashboard and made a mental calculation. Almost 12. He should be waking up about now. The smile that crossed his face was cruel, sadistic. I wonder how long it'll take before he realizes that his friend Alex isn't coming. For a moment he savoured that thought. Then his smile faded and he stepped hard on the accelerator. If he was right, if Maitland was just about then returning to consciousness, he could almost feel what Maitland must be feeling, and the sensation made his skin crawl. And he was right. It was time. In his coffin, Maitland still lay without moving, an unseeing, unfeeling, living corpse in a silent world that presently echoed with a muted, unidentifiable sound. The sound came closer and closer until at last, just as his eyelids fluttered open, it became recognizable. Someone was digging above him. "Alex!" His whisper was weak, but audible. Still half in a daze, he tried to smile and felt the stiff unwillingness of his facial muscles. They would not move. But there was no time to think about that. The horror of where he was, the blackness that surrounded him like something solid that seemed to press in on him, brought a sudden surge of terror. The blackness was solid. It was squeezing him, constricting his lungs. He could not breathe. No! It wasn't the blackness. There was no air. The air in his coffin was almost exhausted. Racking coughs shook him as he clutched at his throat and tried again to breathe. No use. He had to get out. He was buried alive. His hands found the lid of the coffin, pounded on it, but weakly. There was no strength in his arms, and even what little he could muster was ebbing fast. His arms would not obey him. He could only scratch at the lid, his fingernails rasping. "Alex! Alex!" He thought that he spoke the name, but all that issued from his lips was a croak. "Did you hear something?" Above, in the darkness that had grown even colder as the night progressed, Tom was holding his hand out toward the gravedigger as if to stop him from digging further. But the gravedigger did not stop. The look that he gave Tom was pregnant with the scorn that the unimaginative reserve for the imaginative, and his spade did not falter. A few moments later, he had uncovered the lid of the coffin. Carefully, he brushed away the thin layer of earth that still covered it. Maitland, choking inside the coffin, felt rather than heard the scraping of his spade, and a look of renewed hope appeared on his tortured face. Even so, no sound left his lips when he tried again to croak, "Alex! Alex! Alex!" Alex had not forgotten him. Nor indeed had Alex forgotten him. Alex just then was approaching the cemetery, and when his headlights lit up the cemetery gates just ahead of him down the road, his chuckle was grisly. "Hope you're comfortable in there, George." His eyes still on the cemetery gate, he drove on. But even when he was closer, he did not see the little tableau at a distance behind it. And it was a tableau, a frozen moment, as though the actors concerned had just for an instant become statues. The gravedigger had taken up his crowbar and he was standing in the grave beside the coffin with Tom and Jerry staring down at him. For a moment none of them moved. Then the gravedigger set his crowbar to the coffin, heaved, and the lid was prized open. And it was somehow fitting that the moon, as the coffin lid came away, should just then be obscured by a passing cloud, that the air should suddenly turn even more icy, because in that moment the corpse in the coffin sat up, gasping, and drew in huge gulps of the icy air. There was no more silence then. The silence was gone, rent by shrieks of terror as Tom and Jerry ran. They ran blindly, unseeingly in the direction of the gate. They blundered into tombstones, stumbled over graves, and burst through the gates into the roadway beyond, still shrieking and not even seeing the glaring headlights of the car that bore down on them. But if they did not see the car, the driver of the car saw them. Inside it, Alex reacted out of pure instinct. His hands on the wheels swung it hard, so that the car skidded and went into a sweeping turn that spun it like a top and smashed it into a tree that grew by the side of the road, and chunks of metal flew in all directions. A few seconds later, a spark found the car's ruptured gas tank. The explosion that followed transformed Alex into a gruesome mass of torn flesh and broken bones, even before the fire that came hard on its heels spurred it upward in an incredibly hot and all-consuming orange fountain that lighted up the roadway like 1,000 lamps. By its light, Tom and Jerry looked like stunned, frightened gnomes. Uncertain, bewildered, terrified, they could only gape at the flames in silence, overwhelmed by the horror of the last few moments, until, at last, a shout from somewhere behind them made them turn. "Hey!" In the glow of the blazing wreckage that was Alex's funeral pyre, they could see past the gate and well into the cemetery, to where the gravedigger stood beside Maitland's grave and beckoned to them. Had they been in full possession of their faculties, had they not been dazed, they might not have heeded the gravedigger's call. As it was, that beckoning finger drew them so that they walked unwillingly back the way they had come, and that they stood at last again with the gravedigger and looked uncomprehendingly into his dull eyes. "You can give me my money now," the gravedigger said. "He's all yours. Sorry about the head." The head? It was Jerry who spoke, but it was Tom who first began to understand, whose disbelieving stare travelled downward to the crowbar that the gravedigger still held clutched in one huge paw. It was Tom whose already ashen face went even whiter, who gasped, "Oh no, oh no," when he saw the blood and the sickening patches of grey that stained the crowbar's iron length. He would gladly have given his soul in that moment, not to have to look into the grave. And yet he looked. He and Jerry both looked. They had to be certain, but they need not have bothered. Maitland had fallen back into the coffin, and what could be seen of his face was twisted into a peculiar, wondering grimace. The crowbar had split his skull and smashed his brain to paste. Even as they stared, the blood that still flowed in streams and rivulets from his broken head merged into one and hid his questioning grimace behind an opaque veil of red. "What a preposterous story!" Critchett brushed an imaginary speck of lint from his sleeve. Throughout Maitland's recital he had sat with his lips pursed, and there was more than a hint of derision in his voice when he spoke. "A preposterous plan. A preposterous story." Maitland, still held fast by the horror of his own tale, looked through him rather than at him. His eyes wide with lingering recollection, he blinked rapidly as if to blink away the terrible pictures that persisted in his memory. And yet it seems so real. He barely whispered it. Almost as if... Critchett's contemptuous smile was lost upon him. If he heard when Critchett said, almost as if you were actually going to do it. He chose to ignore the question. The others, when it became obvious that there would be no reply, settled back in their chairs. Only the actor showed an unwillingness to let the matter drop. I know the feeling, he said. I've had it often with... He too fell silent, his stare vague and his drink forgotten in his hand, and Critchett leaned forward impatiently. What? The actor let his stare move across the faces that watched him so intently. All right, I'll tell you. His eyes, no longer vague, came into focus, but not on the faces. It was as if he were staring across time and space at something that only he could see. George Maitland's story, Bargain in Death, was written by Jack Olek and narrated, sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. Coming very soon, stay tuned for even more tales from the chilling depths of the vault of horror, from where I will be bringing you Sebastian's fateful story, This Trick'll Kill You, a most charming tale, but a tale nonetheless with a twist indeed somewhat reminiscent of the twisted threads of a hangman's noose.